Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Early Career Psychologist Committee, as well as the Teaching, Training, and Careers Committee. My name is Tiffany Clomax. I'm chair of the ECP Committee, and I am joined here by Dr. Mollimichelle Cabeldue and Dr. Danielle Cooper for our inaugural speaker series. And this year we are focusing on anti-racism. So we are interviewing researchers, scholars, clinical practitioners to find to learn about ways in which they incorporate anti-racism into their work. And so tonight we have two phenomenal volunteers and speakers who will be sharing with us. So first, Dr. Mollimichelle Cabeldue is a licensed psychologist in Texas, Colorado, and Louisiana. She obtained a doctoral degree in clinical psychology with an emphasis in forensic psychology at Fairleigh Dickinson University. She completed an APA accredited internship at Eastern Virginia Medical School and Eastern State Hospital, conducting both treatment and assessment with pretrial defendants found incompetent to stand trial and individuals acquitted and not guilty by reason of insanity. She also completed a postdoctoral fellowship in forensic psychology through Tulane School of Medicine, which focused on forensic assessment. For the past year, Dr. Cabeldue has worked at the Austin State Hospital as a forensic evaluator and is currently transitioning into full-time private practice, completing court-ordered and privately retained forensic evaluations and conducting individual therapy for adults in the areas of complex trauma and substance use. So exciting. Throughout her career, Dr. Cabeldue has been involved in the supervision and training of students at various educational levels and in research focused on issues related to competency to stand trial and violence risk assessment. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Cabeldue. And next up, we have Dr. Danielle Cooper. Danielle T. Cooper, PhD, CPP, is an associate professor of criminal justice and the director of research at the Tau Youth Justice Institute at the University of New Haven. Dr. Cooper completed her BS in Justice Systems with a minor in Business Administration in 2009, her MA in Criminology from the University of Florida in 2011, and her PhD in Criminology with a minor in Organizational Leadership for Nonprofits from the University of Florida in 2015. Dr. Cooper is also a certified prevention professional, certified in Florida and Connecticut, who works with nonprofits.
Okay, I found this on the web for fine serp.
Don't know what that is. Who works with nonprofits and community organizations as a prevention trainer and evaluation consultant. As a committed educator, researcher, and preventionist, she brings her expertise to various practical discussions on juvenile justice policy reform, the experiences of individuals committing sexual offenses, and police authority dynamics within fragile and marginalized communities. Through her work with the local community, she has collaborated with key stakeholders such as youth and their parents, young adults, educators, law enforcement, mental health professionals, and youth serving organizations. Dr. Cooper has spent the past 15 years conducting research and teaching in the areas of youths and young adults, juvenile justice and delinquency prevention, criminological theory, and sex offending. She is currently the principal investigator of a 2018 grant awarded from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, focused on diversionary services and racial and ethnic disparities among justice-involved youth in Connecticut. And she's also the co-principal investigator of a 2021 grant awarded from the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving and the Travelers Championship, focused on improving youth police relations in the greater Hartford area. Furthermore, her current service duties include being an elected member of the University Assessment Committee, appointed member of the IDEA Council, Criminal Justice Undergraduate Committee Chair, and IDEA Council Assessment Subteam Co-Chair. Most recently, Dr. Cooper has been honored with the 2019 Faculty of the Year Award, the 2021 Mokani, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Trio Achiever Alumni Award, the 2021 Faculty Excellence in Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Accessibility, and Belonging Award, and the 2021 Martin Luther King Jr. Vision Faculty Award. She was also selected to serve as one of 4 inaugural faculty teaching fellows for the for the Center for Teaching Excellence in 2021. Wow, both of you are so amazing. Thank you again for being here this evening. So why don't we jump in? I would love to hear more about your main work activities and kind of sort of day-to-day responsibilities. If you could kind of walk us through what sort of like a typical day looks like for you, but what does your practice sort of mostly focus on?
I can start if you'd like. So for the past year or so, I've been working at the Austin State Hospital as a psychologist and forensic evaluator. And so day to day, kind of working as a consultant for treatment teams in the court, doing court-ordered evaluations of competency to stand trial and violence risk assessment for NGRI equities that may be transitioning back into the community. And so I do those, and then I also supervise students doing those same assessments. And also just general psychodiagnostic evaluations and feigning and malingering evaluations. But like you said, I am transitioning into full-time private practice and taking on more evaluations in the jails and for individuals on bond. So specifically competency to stand trial and criminal responsibility evaluations, and seeing individuals for individual therapy. And so kind of starting to see what private practice is going to look like, kind of creating a schedule where I can have a little bit more diversity in my day-to-day, and just really excited about that. So at this point, primarily clinical work that I'm doing.
Dr. Cooper?
I've been at the University of New Haven here in Connecticut since 2015. I'm what you might call a, practitioner scholar or pracademic. And so I kind of identify myself most primarily as a researcher, and I'm like a researcher who teaches. And so I'm really lucky. I'm at a university where my primary research focus, which is juvenile justice and delinquency prevention, has a concentration, meaning there are students who are particularly interested in that level of knowledge in multiple classes that we get to offer. And so I kind of get to do this split where I am both focused on what we consider like workforce development. Like I want them to be the mindful of the concerns that we have about how adults enter into the field as they serve children or as they serve families and communities, especially if they've been justice involved or victimized. But then one of the really things that drew me to the University of New Haven is that before I got there, the Youth Justice Institute was founded in 2014, and we are the staff to a legislative entity that is really about like 40-ish persons or agencies that really represent the well-being of youth in the state of Connecticut. So whether they be specific to justice-involved youth or more broadly to the conversations of criminal justice or health and education and housing. So then as the director of research at the TAU, I am constantly in meetings that are just driving and thumping the discussion that then lends itself to recommendations that then can be taken into consideration in our legislation sessions, but also just as an active listener and, translator of someone who's able to say like, well, I've heard this as an emphasis across various meetings because as staff, I attend more meetings than one person who might be interested in one topic. Those meetings allow us to focus on diversion separately and incarceration separately and racial and ethnic disparity separately and like how we're, engaging families and communities that have been impacted. Like, and I just mean separately because they have their own lane and control of focus, but it really all comes together under the one umbrella. And then I would just also say that I'm very lucky that the work I do additionally for service in the university often falls into the lanes of assessment. So I am actually working with, other colleagues and professors who are trying to advance what it is, once again, that we're offering to students. So we just got done working through moving a critical criminology certificate for our undergraduate students who want to delve more into what's happening in the criminal legal system and how they see themselves or their duties or their opportunity to create solutions or to reduce harm. And I'm also a part of the university initiative to track our campus climate in relation to diversity and inclusion. So I'm lucky in the sense that a lot of what I do lands in the space of research or assessment or evaluation, whether that be within the university, the Youth Justice Institute is part of the university, or even our outreach work. Like I'm in a grant where I'm training officers in Hartford, where we're really working to engage them in a way that allows them to see the opportunity for the restorative kind of mindset, as opposed to kind of just putting people in a place where police are either A, doing their job, or B, just being kind. It's like, no, how do we create a pro-social source of information so that when conflicts arise, you are less likely to make faulty assumptions about young people and the appropriateness of their behavior, but you're also more likely to go seek advisement from young people, from those communities, in a way that makes them more likely to tell you what they need from you as well.
Wow. So for each of your sort of settings, what does it mean to you to be anti-racist in those settings?
Mollimichelle, would you like me to go first? I'm already unmuted. I think this is an interesting question and one that does kind of get addressed. And so I think for me as a Black woman, I have a lot of first internal soul searching to do. I think that when I look at how I serve my students, I do honestly operate at a private university where my criminal justice is a huge draw to the university, but it's also still a predominantly white institution. And when I have to, as just on a human level, experience various levels of exposure to our society, one of the things that it gives me comfort is that I'm going in a space where I think that it's significant that I'm there, that maybe those people need my voice, my interaction. And so I think in order to be authentic when I engage my students, that's the reflection. I have to sometimes tell myself when I'm not okay, when I'm not yet ready to talk to them about things, when I'm not yet ready to ask certain questions, or when you get called. If you can be called on too frequently and you can say, well, now I need to just be in the moment of the sway of like how shocked society is. And so I remember not answering the calls after Roe v. Wade occurred, but I remember answering the calls after George Floyd's trial. I remember, answering the calls, and being in the moment with my students after, just Mike Brown's death and like other kind of things that really impacted me deeply as well. And so I try to, at this point, situate myself as restoratively as possible. And I don't say that as if it's easy. I say it because it's difficult for me. I say it because it is very cultural to maybe potentially be able to cut people off or to be able to just like keep it moving and get the grind going. But I've also been trying to understand more how we're in a seductive state. White supremacy, seductive, racism is seductive. And so then a lot of how people see themselves, how they see themselves advancing, they do opportunistic things. And so then I'm trying to, one, be a model, but then I'm two, trying to like encourage people like and show them like the trajectory that there's many value points to being in service. There's many value points to wanting to confront that you have bias and to reduce the impact of that bias. And that especially, I just think that students who are mine, who claim that they have interest in pursuing the criminal justice field, are at the forefront of where we are concerned about where racist harm has potential. And so then I want them to see that. I want that to not be something that they say, well, nobody ever told me that there's a toward history that we have to discuss of policing or of our legal system or of what justice means and injustice mean for people in our society. I want them to be more comfortable with understanding that they might engage people who are afraid or who have lives that they have not lived or all of those things, so that they are less likely to, in their service as professionals, do less harm. But also, I guess, as good regular people, I want them to be regular good people too.
I think for me, this is, a part of my professional development that has really grown over time. These aren't things that I was exposed to in training or even really talked about really until I got to my postdoctoral fellowship. And I was involved in a diversity didactic that really addressed some of these issues head on. And that was really the first time that I had been engaged in any conversations about them. And I think what I've taken from that, and specific to clinical and forensic work, in order to be anti-racist, I think it's really important to understand the ways that the legal system and social policy have been impacted by systemic oppression. And so in addition to focusing on individual experiences of racism, I try to have, a developed understanding of the ways that structural racism and institutional racism have impacted the people that I work with. And they have in so many ways. And I think so many people aren't aware of that. And so trying to be an advocate for that, trying to communicate with treatment teams and other people about, something that comes up quite a bit is paranoia that we see in individuals with serious mental illness. And some of that paranoia is very cultural, and it comes from really negative interactions with law enforcement. And so seeing that and recognizing that and trying to be an advocate for that. And then I think also just understanding and continuing to look at the privileges that I have and how they impact the work that I do, and use those privileges to actively work against and interrupt racism that I see and encounter.
So Dr. Cabeldue, you actually touched on this a little bit, but I would love to hear maybe a specific example of what that means sort of in the context of your work. What would that actually look like, being anti-racist?
So one really specific example that comes to mind that I've really been thinking about a lot lately and consulting with other people about is relative to malingering evaluations, feigning evaluations. So like I said before, I kind of serve in this consultant role where I do evaluations either for the court or for treatment teams. And we often get referrals for individuals where the treatment team has kind of labeled them as malingering. But really what's going on is this is a person maybe putting forth low effort in the competency restoration process. They've been found incompetent, they're not making progress. And so over the years, I've really tried to expand my understanding of the factors that go into feigning, that contribute to these negative stereotypes. And there are specific, situations where a person is malingering. They are exaggerating psychiatric symptoms that they do not have, or to a degree that they don't. But in some situations, low effort, particularly in marginalized populations, can come from this history of systemic inequalities. So individuals that lacked resources in school, had negative interactions with law enforcement, were subjected to these inequalities. And this low effort is sort of a learned response, or just kind of normal for their day-to-day interactions. And that can be a really normative situation for them. And so I think one way that I try to do that is to give a lot of education to the treatment teams about, there's something very different about someone putting forth low effort in that situation as opposed to a true blue malingerer, and trying to decrease the negative stereotypes that goes along with that. Because particularly, in the state that I'm in, malingerers are not treated nicely in the court system. And once you kind of have that label put onto you, it makes it really hard. You may not get the help that you need later on. And so trying to interrupt that process, give education. I often try to do a little bit of education in the reports that I submit to the court, about what I'm seeing and where this comes from, and, bring this up a lot and have conversations about it.
Would you like me to answer also? I would just, add that, my worlds are like in the classroom and out the classroom. And when I think about the experiences that I'm having with my students, I would say particularly at our university, we've had to make a strong shift in 2020, not just because of the pandemic, but because of the loss and death that was really, shocking to a lot of people, that caused a lot of questions about like what does action look like? And so I think for us, we try to figure out like, what's the base? Like, what's the base? If you're coming into our college, if you're coming into our major, if you're coming into the university is really where the conversation was, but we had more control of the students that are our criminal justice and forensic science college students. And we said, these, once again, are people that we want to be in service. We want people to trust them. We want them to be able to make life and death decisions. And we need them to have a base language. We need to break it all the way down. And so while it wasn't something that previously we had focused on, we shifted what was our freshman class to be more in the space of a discussion about social value, understanding like, how is it that we see certain traits? And as a society, we've been, seduced once again into putting social value on these genders, on these races. But really, the thing you should be putting social value on is the choices that I make, right? How can I show you who I am, where I want to be, how I want to show up, and how does that lead you to make choices about how you want to work with me or not, how you want to support me or not, how you want to spend your money or not things that I can't decide, like my hair or my eye color or other things. And so we use that as a building block, because then our students, as they go through, they end up in other classes like race, class, and gender, where they're talking more specifically within the field about things that have gone wrong. And then once again, this opportunity for us to build this critical criminology certificate is acknowledging that we do still have another level of students that want to be able to go into the workforce and not just be knowledgeable, but to also have a credential that's signifying an expertise and additional effort. And so we've been working on bringing in additional professors and scholars that help us work with our students. We've been working on thinking about ways that we shift what are the ways that we discuss things in our classroom. And so that requires, once again, for us to make reflections. What does it mean about what we learned or didn't learn? Because while I've had critical learnings, I can't say that I had the broadest racial scholarship, whether that be inside or outside of criminological and criminal justice work. And so then Mollimichelle, I think you made an excellent point about some of the choices that you've made in your training in like the last decade that really have allowed me to, one, learn terminology like anti-racist. That was just not a term that we were using, right? To then ask myself, what are my intentions around those things? So once again, how I show up for my students, but also I'm tenured. So in my space, I also show up in what am I asking of my colleagues? Because maybe there wasn't someone to ask this of them 10 or 15 years ago. And I genuinely believe that I have like really good working relationships, because I believe relationships are real like big cornerstone in how we operate. So then I think me asking for things is maybe making people consider things that they weren't considering 5 or 10 years ago. I had colleagues tell me that they were surprised the unanimous vote that we experienced when we put forward a critical criminology certificate in a world that's saying that you can't study critical race theory. We had no problem acknowledging in ourselves, which is quite a large department. So like a 20-person vote had no issue saying like, this is what our students need. This is the future of the education. This is what the workforce is asking for. And if we want to continue to balance what is necessary in theory and what is necessary in practice and what is necessary to be in community with people, then we have to figure out how to not only make it anti-racist, but to make it more also internal, right? To be that continuous conversation and journey. And then the last thing I'll say is that in that kind of like policy space, I think I just have to continue to push the conversation about how we treat each other, how we form those policies, how we evaluate or use the data, and the narratives that we tell ourselves when the data is comfortable or uncomfortable. So then I'm often there to then say and challenge, just even to ask questions, I think is a powerful anti-racist tool that I try to use myself. I would say the other tool is that I'm often very aware of the power of my story. Like, I think it's nice that I have received various awards or that I have achieved a certain thing, but I think that what's most important at any point in time and at all points in time is that I show up, and that because of the work that I believe in and the work that I show, then I believe that people are interested in what I have to say, regardless of any sort of accolades. And I think that that means that I can be an ally, I can be a sponsor, I can be supportive of people. And I can also, I think is an important point, tell myself when I'm wrong, invite people to tell me when I'm wrong, and then call people in when they're wrong. And I think that that keeps the momentum that I'm trying to build around me.
Such good points. So I'm going to pick this next question, A, because both of you interface with students and sort of teach and mentor and all of that, and also B, selfishly for me, because I'm an early career professional. And so I've just gotten sort of cemented kind of in the teaching and mentoring role. And I would love to hear ways that you promote sort of self-awareness and reflexive practices around anti-racist ideology with your students.
Working with students is something that I've really come to enjoy over the last couple of years. And I really try to make supervision a very collaborative process where there's two-way learning occurring. I think that I can learn just as much from working with students as they can learn from me. And because these were not things that were addressed in my training program, the ideas of anti-racism, I try really hard to incorporate that into the discussions that I have with students, by sharing my own experiences and my own thoughts related to the ideas, encouraging them to explore their thoughts and ways that they might want to confront these issues. And I try to be really transparent with students about, my thoughts, but also things that I'm unsure of, or things that I've made mistakes in the past, or times that I've been uncomfortable and maybe in the moment didn't know how to handle it, but in hindsight, maybe this is what I would have done. And I try to be really open in those conversations because I want them to also share what their struggles are, what is difficult for them to talk about, and how can we kind of work through that during supervision so that you can go out and do something better next time. And so I, of course, try to foster a really supportive environment. I want there to be a sense of belonging in the field. I want trainees to be able to explore aspects of their identity that may, influence the work that they do. It will influence the work that they do. And so I want them to be able to explore that. And I think just trying to mirror to them sort of my own process, and that it is a process, that it's not really something that's ever fully achieved, that, we're constantly having experiences at work, outside of work, that shape the way we think. And so I just try to be really open in that conversation. I think supervision is more for that process, as opposed to teaching skills. I mean, you can sit down and teach a person a skill, like, sure. I worked with a student last year who really wanted to learn violence risk assessment. Sure, I can teach you how to do violence risk assessment, but it's going to be much more important for us to have conversations about the way that we conceptualize people, the way that their risk factors have maybe been informed by their identity, by their family, by their interactions. And so I think trying to take that sort of process-oriented stance for myself and for my students is how I address that.
Love that. Dr. Cooper?
I also love so much of what you said, Mollimichelle, especially because I think that it is not a comfortable position to share your stories with your students, because sometimes, especially when you exist in different identities, you want to be able to hold some of yourself outside of like the workspace and it's like view and it's like power and, but I feel like I've learned a level of strength in telling the students the things that have both been difficult for me, whether that's been me just struggling without overt oppression, or times in which people in power have done things that have harmed me, like letting them know that like that didn't stop me from being here, but that they have to be mindful of like how that could have stopped someone like me, how many people it did stop beyond me. And so I'm often trying to balance this narrative of like the micro versus the macro. I try and explain oftentimes that I am a very hopeful, optimistic, and spiritual person. So when you encounter me and you say, how are you doing? And I tell you that I'm doing well, I mean that in that my spirit is well, not like that society's well, like, and so then I often have to pause because I realize that that's not translating to my students, right? We'll do various check-ins, we'll do all types of things. And I'm like, no, I'm upset too about those things, but then I'm often in a conversation with myself about how I am handling the things that I have control over, how I am regulating myself. So then I sometimes am too able to separate how people are still really in the throes of what's going on in the world. I remember doing a check-in with my students after even Roe v. Wade. I was talking with them, and because of the way that I was managing my self-care that day, I was thinking about how literally what I had done in my morning, and I had just had delicious breakfast and I had prepared tea, and I was telling them how I was feeling really prepared to tackle the day. And they were like, but Dr. Cooper, yesterday was the decision and we're still like crying and we're still like preparing to fight with our family. I'm like, no, me too, but I don't know how to and so my students have made it clear to me that it is also important for me to share with them what's going on with me. As I learn various things, I try and figure out ways to bring them into the classroom. So 5 years ago, I was not into mindfulness. 5 years ago, I did not have an understanding like I have of restorative practices. 5 years ago, I didn't even have the level of understanding that I have of social emotional learning and all of these kind of aspects. And so as I think about my students and how I want them to show up, both anti-racist, but as professionals and all of these other things, I also think about making sure that it's clear for them that I'm naming the skills and that I'm less secretive that they're experiencing the skills. So I'm being overt with them that this is us developing a growth mindset. This is us identifying and naming our emotions and identifying regulation skills. This is us pausing and being mindful so that we can bring ourselves to what might be a difficult discussion. These are tools that we use, and I explain to them the tools that I use with you are likely the tools that you'll need to use when you engage with other younger persons, and how you will help their families feel comfortable talking to you, and how so I'm both demonstrating and I'm trying to remind them that like these are the tools. Like when you feel like you don't have tools, because that's the thing that I think is really important for, you know, everyone in your position to remember, is that it is a tool belt, but you do have tools. And sometimes we get to whatever the end of the week is, and we kind of like downplay ourselves, like, I didn't do anything this week. We get to the end of the semester. I don't really know what I learned this week. And I feel like the pandemic makes that even easier to be true. And so then that sort of mindfulness skill, that sort of naming what you're learning, that bringing it to a point of cognition and metacognition, I've really been trying to work to make my students more apt to be able to say that, you know, I have been discussing what racism looks like in the criminal justice system. I have been discussing what it looks like for me to have power over people, because I can control whether or not they are going to get revoked, or whether or not like all of these things are going to happen to them. And so I want them to see themselves. I want them to envision themselves in these conflicts. One, so that it doesn't consume them in the way that we're concerned about burnout for so many people who are in the profession. But two, we know that when you're in those negative emotions, you're likely to use your power less discerning, right? You're likely to go to the default biases into the judgment. So then I'm trying to remind them that they do have that 30 seconds to take a breath, and that they can use these tools. And so that's for me, like, I think what it is the opportunity to just live in front of them, basically, but also name it more clearly, is what they've asked of me in the past few years.
Wow, I love that transparency. That's also something I'm working to step in my own sort of work and teaching. So thank you for saying that. So for the sake of time, I'm actually going to wrap up with this last question. I would love to hear your thoughts sort of within this kind of anti-racist sort of theme. What do you hope for the next generation, especially when it comes to, we talked a lot about training and even more so curriculum. What do you hope we kind of move forward to and do and change and grow into?
I'll jump in because I'm already unmuted. You know, I actually oddly get this question a lot in my work. Like, what do I hope for the youth, or what do I see? And I'm like, I want the youth to know that we hope for what they hope for. And we want to help them see what it is that they hope for, because they are the ones with the vision. They are the ones with the innovation that is not tainted by as much, hopefully, by what are some of the problems. And so I also try to remind, like, I literally just got done, like, I'm doing social justice school. And so when I talk to them about social justice movements, my primary point to them is that it is them. It is their choices. It is the things that agitate them and that impact them, that then they have to realize that they have voice too. That is how every movement comes to be, is someone says, I'm bothered, and I wonder if someone else is bothered too. And I think that if I get enough bothered people, then maybe we can make some changes. And I don't want them to see themselves not in the change movement. I don't want them to think that it happens somewhere outside of them, because if anything that the pandemic has shown us is that your local government, your state government, your federal government, they are doing different things, and how you advocate for yourself, even in your own neighborhood, right? Even in your own house, sometimes that voice is powerful. And I think that so many times people think that they don't have a choice to make. And I think that's part of what has gotten us into this moment, is we think that it's other people's choices or other people's problems. And we're having more conversation of like, well, what does it look like if I'm saying that I'm the community that never thought gun violence would be here, that never thought that trafficking could be in my community? And it's like, your community has people, and it has humans, and it has the opportunities for crime, and it has for victimization, just like anywhere else where there are humans. Thank you.
I think for me, you know, I hope that these ideas that we're talking about become part of earlier training that people in the field receive, you know, that they're introduced to these ideas much earlier on. You know, I've said that for me, I don't really think, I mean, and I even took classes in diversity that didn't address these issues. And so being able to address them earlier on and then going out with a kind of reflective and open-minded approach, and being willing to kind of look at biases, but also, you know, working with others in kind of a supportive environment. You know, we know from the research that it's hard to consider your own bias. We know it's there, but it's hard to identify it. And so, you know, being able to use the support of the people that you work with in consultation and talking about cases, you know, how am I approaching this? How is this being interpreted? And just being comfortable with what's uncomfortable. I think, you know, some of these conversations can be sort of intimidating and challenging. And, you know, maybe there's concern that you aren't going to say the right thing or you're going to be interpreted in the wrong way. And just coming into those conversations, just willing to learn, you know, taking the training that you've had and being willing to continue to learn in the process, I think is what I would hope to see.
Definitely agree with all of what you both said. Thank you so much for your time. We sincerely appreciate it. I've learned so much. I hope our audience is able to take away some things and incorporate into their work. And thank you to the audience so much for watching us this evening.